My name is Kate Mason. I'm coming to you from Australia, and the date today is the 19th of August 2022. As we hit around the 1 year anniversary of when things got really nasty in Australia, the most brutal lockdowns, the violence meted out towards protesters, and the coercive and ugly push towards everyone being injected, I want to pause, reflect, document, and lament. The question I have endlessly running through my mind is, what does it mean to be human? We lost our humanity over the last few years, and we must grapple with what it means to be human as we enter a more technocratic and technological future, an era of computer says no. The powers that be are somewhat admitting the vaccine doesn't work to stop people becoming infected, but they're still in the main patting themselves on the back as to how they've kept us safe and pretending people didn't lose livelihoods due to mandates, and they've glossed over the harms of lockdowns. In this slight reprieve, I want to document an attempt a group of welfare workers made at the end of 2021 to raise awareness to those in power about the harms their pandemic measures were causing people who are in the most vulnerable situations. I will also run through some concepts which are important to making sense of the last few years: communitarianism, technocracy, and morality. I then document the changing nature of the information presented to us, as well as to answer the question of who has truly benefited from the government and global bodies' COVID-19 measures. So we were a group of welfare workers who found each other as we were being forced out of our jobs due to non-vaccination. We came from all around Australia. We believed in the mission statements that our organisations espoused to actively promote cultures of trust and respect, to challenge the causes of human injustice, and to encourage self-determination, choice, and autonomy. We didn't see that this was only relevant until the richest and most powerful dictated otherwise. We believed that individual people's suffering was important to acknowledge and didn't somehow fall for the global good brainwashing narrative, which negates the individual person and their pain. A prime example of this global good narrative is Australian Caitlin Gotts, a young, healthy woman who died shortly after the second injection. Her mother, Raylene, took part in COVID Under Question, a cross-party inquiry. In this, she spoke about her partner, her friends, and Caitlin's friends telling her that Caitlin would have been happy to die for the greater good. It was a sacrifice that needed to happen to protect others, a price that needed to be paid to keep the rest of us safe from COVID. I wish with all my heart that one day Caitlin gets the justice that she and her mother deserve. We as a country are so much worse for how Raylene and Caitlin and many others have been treated. I worked in the welfare sector for many years, in domestic violence, with young women, with youth who are really struggling, children and families, community development, and more. At the end of 2021, I connected with a group of similarly minded welfare workers, and we wrote letters to politicians outlining the harms that have occurred for the most vulnerable members of our community from lockdowns and forced and mandatory vaccinations. After all, the politicians were telling us these measures had to occur to protect the most vulnerable, so we thought they would be concerned. These letters are available for anyone who is interested, and so are the responses from the MPs when we did get responses. But I am going to go through, I'll say, a point or two that we made for each sector of the community. So the youth workers outlined in their letter that there were increasing instances of school refusal and young people falling behind due to extended lockdowns. They stated this predominantly affected youth who came from more disadvantaged households and who were already at risk of school refusal. Homelessness and mental health had also gone through the roof, struggling families, intake channels clogged, domestic violence and financial difficulties among the reasons youth are becoming homeless. Not to mention, unvaccinated young people have had to leave homelessness programs, which put them back on the street. The domestic violence workers outlined that women were further isolated from family and friends during lockdown, women who had previously been planning to leave the violent relationship staying due to decrease in opportunities to escape and difficulties in accessing support to leave. Reduced access to support and community services as many closed for containment reasons. women disengaging from support services due to perpetrators' constant presence in the home, increase in triggers for violence in the home, stress, substance, alcohol consumption, and financial pressures. The lockdown measures imposed increased all three of these for families, leading to a sharp increase in the severity of physical and sexual assaults within the home, increase in defendants charged with more serious offences such as attempts to choke and strangle vulnerable children and families. The workers wrote, "Families' vulnerabilities are increased. We have serious concerns for children living within vulnerable family units and who have experienced significant traumas regarding disruption to their schooling. For vulnerable children, school can be a stable and safe place. Extensive lockdowns in 2020 and 2021 have seen children being homeschooled. This has put additional stresses on vulnerable families as well as created heightened safety issues. It's also meant a lack of eyes on children to allow for early intervention if the child becomes at risk." Foster care workers. "The public health order has broken the most vulnerable down, leaving them feeling stressed, anxious, scared, and further disadvantaged without much needed supports. Over the past 18 months, we've observed an increase in domestic violence reports, a major increase in suicide intention by children as young as 9 years of age, an increase of child protection reports from families with no prior history of child protection reports, as well as an increase in mental health issues, family violence, and drug and alcohol addiction abuse concerns. Disability. The public health order has taken away choice and control for people with disabilities, and we are seeing firsthand the impact that the health order is having. Our findings include, but are not limited to, increased stress, anxiety, financial crisis, increased behavioural issues, isolation, depression, additional stress on families and support systems. People with disabilities have lost long-term support workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, occupational therapists, counsellors, and many other support services through staff being fired due to not wanting to receive the COVID-19 vaccination. In these cases, long-term client and worker relationships have been destroyed. In addition, this is leaving a skilled staff shortage in the industry. Alcohol and other drugs. Children in interim care are being disadvantaged by the delay of court cases whereby physical contact between parents and children removed are being paused for an extra 6 to 9 months compared to normal times. Untold trauma to children and family breakdowns are more likely to occur. Extra pressure, extra trauma, which then results in alcohol and other drug abuse. Additionally, we collected over 50 testimonials from workers, many heartbreaking in their distress of what was happening to them as they were being fired. Pretty much all welfare workers have been fired who didn't vaccinate. They outlined service closures and vulnerable clients being made more vulnerable, anxiety, depression, and suicidal feelings going through the roof. Clients being coerced to vaccinate, loss of the relationships they had with their client and clients feeling abandoned and without hope. Here are some statements from welfare workers. This is only a very small selection. This is the welfare worker testimonials. Disability, this is a disability worker. There was a lot of pressure in the group homes that the organisation ran with team leaders and some of the staff putting pressure on residents to take it, talking about the vaccine. The worst part, though, was that several of these clients were not capable of making truly informed consent in the first place. Many of them will just go along with whatever you say, while not even really understanding it in the first place. As a survivor of domestic violence, abuse, and trauma, I found this whole process by those in power extremely traumatic, much like a domestic violence dynamic of beating people down into submission, gaslighting, blaming the victim, no one believes the victim, having no voice, feeling alienated and alone. My mental health has taken me to some very dark places in recent months. I've had a number of participants struggling with anxiety and depression, and I've had many have their GPs increase antidepressant medications, or some start taking antidepressant medications. I actually had one of my team participants commit suicide. I was a DV manager perpetrator program. I told my boss that we educate the men about the destructiveness of coercion and control, and that the organisation and government was now using these same techniques on myself and my colleagues. My boss didn't like to hear this. What our government has done with these mandates and lockdowns has been horrific. not to mention the media propaganda, which has put unacceptable fear into the minds of people that have already enough challenges to contend with on a daily basis. There was widespread coercion on all levels, with insufficient information provided. Everyone was rushed into making a decision. The responses caused more damage than the threat of the virus. How am I supposed to advocate for women experiencing financial violence and coercion as a part of domestic violence when my workplace is doing the same thing to me? When the pandemic started in 2020, I was working in family services with the Aboriginal community. We were told we weren't allowed to complete face-to-face visits. All visits had to be video call or phone calls. My family struggled to get enough food. I had families with roughly 5 to 9 children. Child protection would often threaten families with removing the children as parents were unable to feed their children. I would often sneak out and go to community organisations to get food for them and complete face-to-face home visits without approval. I watched these families suffer in silence as no one listened. I couldn't take it anymore, so I resigned. The impact of lockdowns on women experiencing domestic violence is extremely concerning, as the perpetrators have untethered access and power to hold a woman basically hostage in her home, with all supports cut off. I wanted to wait and make a more informed choice before I chose to get the vaccine, but when the mandates rolled in, I felt forced. I developed anxiety and would have regular mental breakdowns due to the pressure of deciding if I should take an experimental vaccine or stand by my ethics, but sacrifice my financial security and my social freedoms. The scariest part of all is watching our service and others push these jabs on the young and vulnerable, who really don't yet have the cognitive ability to foresee consequences and long-term impacts. We work with youth drug users. By definition, these are the most impulsive subculture that exist on instant gratification and reduced brain and psychological development. All they want to do is to be accepted and fit in and have freedoms. I feel the sector is exploiting their client base to meet the demands of the governing bodies. When the alcohol and other drug unit was closed, the exiting of vulnerable clients and closing the service had a great impact. Many women were in hospital detoxing and on a waiting list and then had nowhere to go. Hospital staff at the detox unit there were calling in disarray, not knowing where to place the women after their detox was completed. Some of the clientele at that time had child protection services involvement, and one in particular had just returned to the unit with a newborn baby with hospital child protection services involvement. She ended up exited with no stable, secure housing. I believe she went to a friend's and couch surfed. This risk factor would have most probably resulted in another child of hers being removed from her care. Others returned to undesirable family environments not conducive with their recovery goals. I remain passionate about supporting women and children experiencing violence. I loved my job, and I am devastated that it will end this way, but I will not be coerced as an individual to consent to a vaccination without making a well-informed choice, free of undue pressure, especially not from a service who strongly advocates for women's autonomy and choice. I work for a service as a children and youth counsellor. I worked with families who had witnessed domestic violence and identified as Aboriginal. I witnessed lateral violence from mandating, as well as coercion by counsellors who advised scared, vulnerable families to get vaxxed. I regarded this as an abuse of power, as these families are looking to the counsellors for support. They trust them for guidance, and the guidance they got was to do the right thing and get jabbed. I had young clients who would talk to me about the fear they felt about vaccinations, and I would keep my ideas to myself. It felt like a double standard when it was okay to advise getting the jab, but not okay to advise the clients to trust their own instincts and choose accordingly. I experienced colleagues coming up in my face with great aggression, saying that I was irresponsible and putting lives at risk because I did not want to have this experimental substance injected into me. I also had compassionate management who had to sacrifice me, for the greater good, so as to maintain their funding. It was something they had to do under legal advisement. We sent these testimonials, the welfare letters, and a cover letter outlining the common concerns for the most vulnerable members of our community to hundreds of MPs, Governor General, and the public health officials. We also sent them to peak bodies who are meant to represent these client groups. And in our cover letter, we stated, a democratically elected government has a responsibility to minimise the potential for adverse effects of public health responses on marginalised and vulnerable groups. We additionally assert that politicians have a responsibility to undertake rigorous and transparent cost-benefit analysis when sweeping changes are made that drastically alter the foundations of society. We have undertaken the work of collecting testimonials and writing letters, not for any gain for ourselves, but because we have legitimate concerns. In return, we request you outline the processes you have undertaken, which we assert needs to be meaningful, transparent, and rigorous, to grapple with the complexity of how government COVID-19 measures have affected the vulnerable communities we represent. Come to a website called A Sense of Place magazine, and they have there an interview with Gigi Foster. And Gigi Foster is an economic professor at the University of New South Wales in Sydney and co-authored the book, The Great COVID Panic. She is and was a fierce opponent of lockdowns and mandates that have caused so much damage to the Australia's economy and long-standing tradition of human rights. Gigi says, I think as soon as you start looking at the idea of doing cost-benefit analysis for lockdowns, you realise that they're a madness, so they can't be defended. And she goes on to say, I really feel that this is going to create a cost that is not being recognised at the moment, even by people who are looking at the disruption to education that we've inflicted upon our children and thinking about the long-term cost of that. But this exchange and being able to visit other cultures, it's hugely important for keeping us a peaceful and vibrant society. An absolute travesty has unfolded, and it's been justified by doing it for the common good. But whose common good? Who has actually benefited? And I will answer that question by the end of this video. I'll just read a little excerpt from the book, The Great COVID Panic, which Gigi Foster co-wrote. All those months of obsession crowded out attention, care, and concern for so much else. The fearful were the perfect victims for those with cooler heads, who recognised that this was a unique opportunity to seize power and wealth for themselves. The paralysis of the fearful led in the end to heartless neglect, social disintegration, widespread theft, and totalitarian control. The human costs were vast. Children depressed about their worth in life, told that their slightest expression of love and joy could kill their grandparents. Whole populations unhealthier, too afraid to exercise outside, or actually prevented from doing so by government edict. Hospitals closed to normal caregiving and surgical procedures cancelled. Mass starvation in poor nations that cost the lives of 1 million and plunged millions more into misery, caused not by a virus, but by active government policies. Hundreds of millions lost their jobs, life roles, freedom to travel, and motivation to rise in the morning. It could be said that in the first 3 months of 2020, billions of people on the planet turned their backs on life, living instead in a kind of twilight zone, weakly illuminated by the vague hope of a vaccine. Many became zombie conformers, stuck in their homes and gradually losing their humanity. When the harms from the last few years are acknowledged by global bodies or by the government, it will always be couched in the terms of the harms from the pandemic or from COVID. And this gives it an inevitability that there was nothing more that could be done about it. It was an unfortunately inevitable situation and response to a crisis. This is inaccurate. The harms caused were from the constant bombardment of fear messaging from media, government and global bodies, and the government measures put in place of lockdowns and coerced and mandatory vaccinations. It's important to be alert to the reframing of the narrative as it's being used to minimize and gaslight what really occurred. It also minimizes any responsibility government has for the suffering unleashed. And here is a prime example. UNICEF, who is an arm of the United Nations, released this article on March the 10th, 2022, Pandemic Pushing More Families Deeper into Poverty. A new report using data from 35 countries shows that 2/3 of households with children have experienced income loss during the COVID-19 pandemic, leaving many struggling to afford food, housing, healthcare, education, and other essentials. Due to government responses to the pandemic, including lockdowns and coerced and mandatory vaccinations, people have become more dependent on government funding. The same governments who created the measures on advice from UN bodies are now coming in with solutions, which is government dependency. As history has a way of being wiped out and only one narrative prevailing, I'll quickly go through just to document some articles which detail only a small fractions of the harms caused. We have the World Health Organization, Mental Health and COVID, Early Evidence of the Pandemic's Impact, Scientific Brief. So this was the 2nd of March 2022. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a severe impact on the mental health and well-being of people around the world, while also raising concerns of increased suicidal behaviour. In addition, access to mental health services has been severely impeded. So again, I want to point out, it's the 3rd time I'm pointing it out in this video because it needs to be endlessly pointed out that they're only saying it's because of the pandemic, not the measures that governments put in place and not the measures that the World Health Organization themselves espoused. High levels of suicidal ideation and depression symptoms observed during lockdowns. A large comprehensive survey of Victorian adults undertaken by the COPE initiative at the height of Melbourne's long lockdown in September 2020, because this is written in August 2021, found 1 in 3 survey respondents screened positive for anxiety or depression symptoms, and 1 in 10 reported that they had recently seriously considered taking their own lives. So this was very early on in the lockdowns. Melbourne went on to become the most locked down city in the whole world. We then go on to people with a disability stranded in bed for hours due to home care worker shortage. I want to also point out here that when you see these articles, they never mention that because of the people being fired, the disability and aged care sectors are at least have been mandated for a booster. And I'm not sure if they've gone on to the 4th. It'd be different between each state and territory. But increasingly, as it's gone along, more and more people have left the industry because of the vaccine mandates. Melbourne woman sets herself on fire inside car with signs, "No one cares, mandates are killing us." Melbourne man sets himself on fire after shouting out about vaccine mandates. Again, Melbourne was the most locked down city in the world. So this travesty of what's happened to people there is on the shoulders of the Labor Premier, Daniel Andrews. Unvaccinated parents will be banned from seeing their own sick kids in Western Australian hospitals under strict new laws from Mark McGowan. So that was in January of this year, 2022. Mark McGowan is the Premier of Western Australia. Welfare concerns for children exposed to more family violence during COVID-19 lockdowns. This is April 2021. COVID-19 lockdowns made it harder than ever for mothers like Anna to leave violent homes. While the strict stay-at-home orders meant isolation and monotony for many, others were trapped with their abusers. Cut off from the sanctuary of school, children were isolated from teachers, extended family, and friends. Crime Statistics Agency data released exclusively to the ABC by Monash University's Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre showed children's presence at police-reported family violence incidents increased by 29.4% in Victoria between April and June last year, compared with the same period in 2019. So they're talking about 2020, very early on in the lockdowns. Here we have, for the sake of the forgotten voices of the pandemic, reopen Australia's schools. This is mid-January 2022. 35 of Australia's top academics, doctors and community leaders have written the following to Australian governments, and they outline why children need to be returned to school. And just one of the most relevant for this discussion, for this video, is A delay in returning to in-person learning puts children's mental health at risk, with additional increases in the risk of child abuse, obesity, and delayed social and emotional development. The lifelong impact of this is not known. COVID-19 lockdowns caused a disturbing spike in online child exploitation activity in Australia. Pedophile activity online has skyrocketed in Australia during the COVID-19 pandemic, as protracted lockdowns have forced children into spending prolonged time on the internet. How Daniel Andrews was warned Victoria's endless lockdowns were responsible for a staggering 1 in 10 of all suicides, as Premier declares his handling of the pandemic a triumph. Daniel Andrews and the Victorian government have been accused of gross negligence amid claims they ignored court data that almost 10% of suicides in 2020 were linked to COVID-19 lockdowns. Shadow Mental Health Minister has slammed the Premier and his government for failing to act on the worrying data, which emerged as the state entered its 4th lockdown within 15 months in late May. She's obtained a ministerial briefing note to Mental Health Minister James Merlino under Freedom of Information laws, which warned COVID-related stresses were linked to a spike in Victorians taking their own lives. Small business groups say Sydney's ongoing lockdown will cause loss of staff and spike in mental health issues. Again, mid-2021. Alexi Boyd, Interim Chief Executive of the Council of Small Business Organisations, said while restrictions must be guided by medical advice, there's nothing more devastating to small businesses than the uncertainty of a lockdown. Not only does it cause a massive loss of income to zero in most cases, but knock-on effects for the broader economy as well, and the mental health plight of business owners, Boyd tells Smart Company. The real reason you're feeling exhausted in COVID lockdown, drinking alcohol has become a popular coping mechanism and has been promoted heavily throughout rolling lockdowns. But the additional drinks are doing Aussies more harm than good, according to Katerina Georgi, Chief Executive of alcohol research organisation FAIR. And just finally, there's so many more articles, but it will go on for hours. We have the Great Barrington Declaration, an infectious disease epidemiologist and public health scientist. We have grave concerns about the damaging physical and mental health impacts of the prevailing COVID-19 policies, and recommend an approach we call focused protection. Coming from both the left and the right and around the world, we have devoted our careers to protecting people. Current lockdown policies are producing devastating effects on short and long-term public health. The results, to name a few, include lower childhood vaccination rates, worsening cardiovascular disease outcomes, fewer cancer screenings, and deteriorating mental health, leading to greater excess morality in years to come, with the working class and younger members of society carrying the heaviest burden. Keeping students out of school is a grave injustice. In my quest this year to make sense of the devastation unleashed and what it is really about, I was kindly shown the work of Nikki Rapana and Nordica Frederick, who wrote the AntiCommunitarian Manifesto. You can get this online, so just search for it. I will talk a little bit about what communitarianism is, and then I'm going to touch on technocracy and then go on and just mention morality. Nikki defines communitarianism as the perfect merger of communism, socialism with its former opposite, capitalism, free trade. So it's a merger. She states that in the new communitarian global paradigm, individual rights are replaced with the rights of the community, which are only vaguely defined. The communitarian solution to all our woes is to balance selfish individualism and dangerous outdated ideas of nationalism against the enlightened idea of the global collective good. And communitarianism leads to regulation. Communitarian values promote sustainability, so this is Nikki writing, livability and quality of life by regulating the smallest details of life. We have to be controlled because we are dangerous to each other. The control needs to be enforced externally to make us behave like good citizens. The regulations tighten around us, and those who control us are those who have the most power and the most to gain. So it sounds very familiar to what we've gone through in the last 2 years. Klaus, who was the second president of the Czech Republic, states, Because of ambitions to change human beings, communitarianism is a form of elitism. Its advocates have the feeling that they have been chosen to advise, to moralize, to know better than the normal people what is right or wrong, what the people should do, what will be good for them. They want us not only to be free, but to be good, just, moral as well, of course, in their definition of what is good, just, and moral. Communitarianism wants to socialize us by forcing us into artificial, not genuine, not spontaneously formed groups or groupings. And it also works to that we start to police each other. We turn each other in, we turn against each other, and we won't tolerate anyone who has a divergent view. And this has been encouraged by the people in power, the politicians within Australia. And here are some examples. And here we are in the middle of the lockdown time in Sydney, when people were starting to get together and protest. Police released CCTV to identify more anti-lockdown protesters. Police seek more protesters. So they put up images of people that were at protests and asked the public to ring in and dob them in. And we also had a lot of public shaming of anyone who didn't follow the lockdown rules. And this was criminal, this is an example, criminal deceit, the language, from teens behind Brisbane COVID-19 scare. So this is a whole story. These young women, these poor young women were splashed all over media and hated, and basically support the media and politicians have scapegoated and allowed these young women to be on the receiving end of a huge amount of vitriol. So they went to Melbourne and they came back to Queensland, basically. And the way they create this system of communitarianism is through technocracy. And technocracy is a theory or system of society in which government is controlled by scientists, engineers, and other experts. We become ruled by bureaucracy, and the ideal bureaucrat is identical to a computer. They strictly adhere to the logic of their system without being distracted by the individuality of the people they assist. There's no nuance. There's no subjectivity. There's no sense of taking into account the situation. Technocracy is a small group of experts advising, often without any accountability for the outcomes of their advice. And an example of this is ATAGI, the advisory body to the Australian government, to the public health officials, and start to notice how often government leaders talk about the experts to justify their measures. And increasingly, I'm noticing they don't even feel like they have to reference who the experts are anymore. Just look back and look at how often experts is said. This expert said, this expert said. This article documents technocracy, lies, damned lies, and ATAGI statements. So this person, Robin is documenting that she received from her local MP a Merry Christmas message, which says in paragraph 3, I thank all Australians who have helped us achieve a 90% rate of double vaccination. As we continue to live with the virus, getting your booster shot is the best way to make sure you're as protected as possible against Omicron. Now, Robin wrote back to that politician and asked this question: could you please provide scientific evidence for the statement in your email sent? As we continue to live with the virus, getting your booster shot is the best way to make sure you are as protected as possible. But it's Omicron. And then she puts in some data, Robin puts in some data that indicates that those who have received 3 doses of a vaccine and test positive for COVID-19 are more likely to be infected with infections compatible with the Omicron variant compared with those who are unvaccinated, and goes on to say more. And the response she got back was this: Miss Andrews and the federal government MPs generally rely on the medical advice that is provided by ATAGI. This is a trusted medical advice from experts in the field. There will no doubt be a variety of opinions out there on many medical issues. particularly when there are new diseases arising. The government must make decisions based on trusted information, and that is why they base their decisions on the advice of the ATAGI. A statement on this is available on the ATAGI website. So that is what you're going to get in a technocratic state. You're going to get that basic answer that the experts have said this is the best way to go, and a shutdown on any other dialogue, which is exactly what we found with us as welfare workers. We couldn't get any real engagement on the issues raised. It was just these statements that were made by experts. Morality has been co-opted and misused as a coercion technique. We were told by officials that those who raise questions, raise concerns about government overreach, or who were concerned about the jabs were immoral and less virtuous than those who did what they were told for the common good. Instead of being treated with respect, given a public platform and allowance for public debate, the opposite occurred. People were called anti-vaxxers, shunned, silenced, and sneered at. People's concerns were given no legitimacy, and the techniques used to discredit were a form of gaslighting. Gaslighting is a technique that undermines a person's perception of reality. When someone is gaslighting you, you may second-guess yourself, your memories, recent events, and perceptions. Here are some examples of the discrimination and division that officials stirred up. The Premier of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, saying this is the Victoria's plan to keep the unvaccinated locked up until 2023. While Victoria, so when was this? This was November the 2nd, end of 2021. While Victoria is planning on dropping almost all of its COVID restrictions when the state hits its 90% double dose vaccination target, Premier Daniel Andrews has warned unvaccinated residents will be banned from extra freedoms for the entirety of 2022. Whether it's a bookshop, a shoe shop, a pub, cafe, a restaurant, the MCG, the list goes on and on, Mr. Andrews said last month, you will not be able to participate like a fully vaccinated person because you're not a fully vaccinated person. Here we have Brad Hazzard, who is the New South Wales Minister for Health.
I think this pandemic has been a clarion call to nurses who are in the profession, but also nurses who've left the profession to come back and fight this virus. We're at war. And you just heard what Michelle said. There's a real enthusiasm for the entire team to be there fighting the virus. And so if there are some that haven't decided to respond to that, well, that's a matter for them. But I'm quite confident that when I see them, I talk to them every day. New South Wales health staff generally, doesn't matter whether you're the cleaners making sure that the virus is being cleaned out of the hospitals, or whether it's the nurses, or whether it's the doctors, or the front patients serving administrative staff. They're all working their backsides off, putting it bluntly. And that's why we keep saying, give them a fair go, folks. Go and get vaccinated. Not getting vaccinated is actually self-entitled and indulgent in the extreme in the middle of a pandemic. Go and get vaccinated and be fair to the rest of your community.
So just in stating there, that is the paradigm that was set up, that if you don't get vaccinated, you are being, you're not doing the right thing by your community. Here we have the Premier of the Northern Territory with the most outstanding speech during the lockdowns. I'll just play it. So Premier of Northern Territory, Michael Gunner.
I think at all that your rhetoric around calling people anti-vaxxers, some of whom were vaccinated, has had an impact at all on vaccine take-up in parts of the territory?
No, and I'll repeat it. If you are anti-mandate, you are absolutely anti-vax. I don't care what your personal vaccination status is. If you support, champion, give a green light, give comfort to, support anybody who argues against the vaccine, you are an anti-vaxxer. Absolutely. Your personal vaccination status is utterly irrelevant. If you campaign against the mandate, if you campaign against people being vaccinated in vulnerable settings, teachers in classrooms, I'll be really clear. At that point in time, people were actually supporting the idea of a teacher being unvaccinated in a remote community classroom with kids who cannot be vaccinated. I reject that. I still reject it. And if you are out there in any way, shape or form campaigning against this mandate, you are absolutely anti-vax. If you say pro-persuasion, stuff it, shove it. We are absolutely going to make sure as many Territorians as possible are vaccinated. That is our best protection against this thing. And if you look at the Doherty modelling, it's only come out since, that says if we double dose at 80 in remote communities, 5 and up, I think you'll see our vaccine mandate is absolutely crucial to protecting lives, particularly Aboriginal life. And I will never back away from supporting vaccines. And anyone out there who comes for the mandate, you are anti-vax.
So that was the epitome of, I don't know what to call that, but that was the epitome of the argument around the vaccines, where even if you were fully vaccinated and were concerned about government overreach or the many, many other concerns you may have had during that time, you were also considered anti-vax, an anti-vaxxer. There's a lot of examples of this, but I'll just share one more. This is Gladys, who was the Premier of New South Wales. In New South Wales, we had an 11 a.m. showing every day at 11 a.m. She got up and the Chief Health Ministers got up and basically and told everyone what they should be doing.
Like us who hang around.
Well, I certainly hope that all of you are vaccinated. I wouldn't want to be in the room with lots of people who aren't vaccinated. And I certainly hope that all of our colleagues are vaccinated. That's the message we've been sending the community. And obviously, as workplaces open up, every workplace will have their policies according to what the government's indicating. But I just want to...
With the book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, by Desmond, one of the things he says in there that's worth noting is the new morality is also more and more aggressively enforced, both by the government and by the population itself. Support for free speech, freedom of the press, artistic freedom, and basic self-determination is decreasing at an alarming rate. It's not just something that happens either, this language that's put on anti-vaxxers, the anti-vaxxer language, or the push that's put towards getting people to do according to what the government messaging is. It's researched and it's worked out what messaging makes people comply and what coercion works. So here we have a Yale study, pervasive messaging to increase COVID-19 vaccine uptake intentions. And they talk about using and trialing different sorts of messaging and what works. So there's self-interest. It reduces the risk that you could get sick and die. It has community interest. So again, this communitarianism idea. Stopping COVID-19 is important because it reduces the risk that members of your family and community could get sick and die. It's got community interest and guilt. Imagine how guilty you'll feel if you choose not to get vaccinated and spread COVID-19 to someone you care about. Then it's got community interest and embarrassment. Imagine how embarrassed and ashamed you will be if you choose not to get vaccinated and spread COVID-19. And then community interest and anger. Imagine how angry you will be if you choose to not get vaccinated and spread COVID-19 to someone you care about. It's got the not bravery. Soldiers, firefighters, EMTs and doctors are putting their lives on the line to serve others during the COVID-19 outbreak. That's bravery. But people who refuse to get vaccinated against COVID-19 when there's a vaccine available because they don't think they will get sick or aren't worried about it aren't brave. They are reckless. There's the good old trust the science. Getting vaccinated against COVID-19 is the most effective means of protecting your community. We have to follow scientific approaches, etc., etc. We've heard that endlessly through the campaign. Personal freedom. COVID is limiting people's ability to live their lives. If you don't get vaccinated, you're part of limiting other people's freedom. Economic freedom and the community economic benefit. So trying out those different messages and seeing how it works to get people to vaccinate. The United Nations has their own behavioral science unit because they're aware that it's very important to influence the way people behave. So this is their report, behavioral science report, and in it they discuss in many areas successful outcomes in the UN's work depends on changes in human behavior. Making healthy choices, taking medicine, allowing a child to go to school, finding decent work and saving money. Behavioral science can improve outcomes through facilitating understanding of the barriers that prevent people from engaging or following through with their actions, the enablers that assist people in achieving their goals, and the impact of interventions based on understanding of these barriers, enablers, or premised on commitments to human dignity, transparency, and respect for ethical requirements. There's a huge amount to unpack within all of this. I can only give it lip service, but basically it's programming human behavior, and there are ethical concerns about that. Basically what's going on is a battle for your mind to influence the way you think for the prescribed common good. The inhumane measures and treatment of people over the last few years have been justified by one statement: trust the science. Anyone questioning the science is seen as a heretic and dangerous. But if we look objectively at the different messaging we received over the last few years, how are we objectively to trust what has unfolded? Here we have some articles that outline compromised science. US public health agencies aren't following the science, officials say. People are getting bad advice and we can't say anything. The calls and text messages are relentless. On the other end are doctors and scientists at the top levels of the NIH, FDA and CDC. They're variously frustrated, exasperated and alarmed about the direction of the agencies to which they've devoted their careers. It's like a horror movie I'm being forced to watch and I can't close my eyes, one senior FDA official lamented. People are getting bad advice and we can't say anything. That particular FDA doctor was referring to two recent developments inside the agency. First, how with no solid clinical data, the agency authorised COVID vaccines for infants and toddlers, including those who'd already had COVID. And second, the fact that just months before the FDA bypassed their external experts to authorise booster shots for young children. And that doctor is hardly alone. At the NIH, doctors and scientists complained to us about low morale and lower staffing. The Vaccine Research Centre has had many of its senior scientists leave over the last year, including the director, deputy director, and chief medical officer. They have no leadership right now. The CDC has experienced a similar exodus. There's been a large amount of turnover. Morale is low. One high-level official at the CDC told us things have become so political as what are we there for? Another CDC scientist told us, I used to be proud to tell people I work at the CDC. Now I'm embarrassed. Why are they embarrassed? In short, bad science. The longer answer, that the heads of their agencies are using weak or flawed data to make critically important public health decisions, that such decisions are being driven by what's politically palatable to people in Washington or to the Biden administration, and that they have a myopic focus on one virus instead of overall health. We have the National Library of Medicine, the National Centre for Biotechnology Information. The COVID-19 pandemic is one of the most manipulated infectious disease events in history, characterised by official lies in an unending stream led by government bureaucracies, medical associations, medical boards, the media, and international agencies. We've witnessed a long list of unprecedented intrusions into medical practice, including attacks on medical experts, destruction of medical careers among doctors refusing to participate in killing their patients, and a massive regimentation of healthcare led by non-qualified individuals with enormous wealth, power, and influence. For the first time in American history, a president, governors, mayors, hospital administrators, and federal bureaucrats are determining medical treatments based not on accurate, scientifically based, or even experience-based information, but rather to force the acceptance of special forms of care and prevention, including remdesivir, use of respirators, and ultimately a series of essentially untested messenger RNA vaccines. For the first time in history, medical treatment protocols are not being formulated based on the experience of the physicians treating the largest number of patients successfully, but rather individuals and bureaucrats and bureaucracies that have never treated a single patient, including Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, EcoHealth Alliance, the CDC, the World Health Organization, state public health officers, and hospital administrators. We have a similar issue with the Therapeutic Goods Association in Australia, the TGA. This is an older article based on 4 years ago. Australia's health watchdog accused of too close relationship with industry. Australia's drug and medical device watchdog, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, needs a complete overhaul to distance it from the health industry and allow consumers to sue it for negligence, says academics and consumer advocate. The current regulatory framework is is a complete bypass of the interests of consumers. They do not have a stake at the table. The medical profession's fair degree of lobbying power and pharmaceutical companies as big ticket players in the economy were issues when it came to consumer protections. The TGA's adverse events reporting system to detect serious drug and device problems was described by women as something of a black hole with lots of information going into it, but nothing visible coming out. Forum member and Victorian Health Issues Centre Chief Executive Danny Vadaz said the nexus between companies, the medical profession and the TGA was insidious and undermines the integrity of our regulatory system. What quality of guardianship can you expect when the poacher is paying the wages of the gamekeeper? The government must act to give the TGA financial independence from Big Pharma, to raise the evidentiary bar on safety and quality to be held accountable for its singular purpose to protect the safety of the public. And this is because the TGA is paid by the pharmaceutical companies in the regulation of their products. Industry sponsorship and research outcomes systematic review with meta-analysis. Clinical research is widely sponsored by drug and device companies. We investigated whether industry-sponsored drug and device studies have more favourable outcomes and differ in risk of bias compared with studies having other sources of sponsorship. The review is an update of a previous Cochrane review. So basically they look at when they studied the papers, industry-sponsored studies more often had favourable efficacy results and more often favourable conclusions compared with non-industry sponsored studies. 2 senior FDA officials resign over Biden administration booster plan. This was at the end of 2021. They have frustrations with the Biden administration plans to move forward with recommending COVID-19 booster shots without their prior approval. And this is in the Lancet, considerations in boosting COVID-19 vaccine immune responses. A new wave of COVID-19 cases caused by the highly transmissible Delta variant is exacerbating the worldwide public health crisis and has led to consideration of the potential need for an optimal timing of booster doses for vaccinated populations. Although the idea of further reducing the number of COVID-19 cases by enhancing immunity in vaccinated people is appealing, any decision to do so should be evidence-based and consider the benefits and risks for individuals and society. COVID-19 vaccines continue to be effective against severe disease, including that caused by the Delta variant. Most of the observational studies on which this conclusion is based are, however, preliminary and difficult to interpret, precisely due to potential confounding and selective reporting. Careful and public scrutiny of the evolving data will be needed to assure that decisions about boosting are informed by reliable science more than by politics. Again, a call for caution. Here we have the British Medical Journal. Politicians and governments are suppressing science, argues the BMJ. UK's pandemic response relies too heavily on those with worrying competing interests. Politicians and governments are suppressing science, and when good science is suppressed, people die, argues a senior editor at the BMJ today. Executive editor Dr. Kamran Abbasi argues that COVID-19 has unleashed state corruption on a grand scale and it is harmful to public health. Then we come over to the conflicting information given about the vaccines and whether or not they stopped you from getting infected and transmitting. And this is the ABC. Turns out the vaccines do stop you getting COVID. It sounds much the same, but the difference is actually huge. Stopping infection means you don't have to have the virus at all, and this won't go on to infect others. A study in the journal The Lancet has looked at both the Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines and found that they do indeed stop infection, which is great news, but sadly not all the time. Professor warns COVID vaccine doesn't stop infection in children. An Australian COVID expert has warned new data shows the Pfizer vaccine offers very little protection against infection for young children. New York Health Department researchers found the 2-dose Pfizer shot was only 12% effective at preventing Omicron in children aged 5 to 11 after only a month. Dr. Anthony Fauci admits COVID vaccines don't work overly well at stopping infection. Here we have the Victorian Chief Health Officer, And this is just a prime example of how the messaging is endlessly changed.
Getting that third dose is protection against severe illness, but also protection against getting infected in the first place. Despite 2, 3, 4 doses of the vaccine, it's not so good at preventing infection in the first place. So we are getting infected. That's why we've had tens of thousands of cases in this wave.
We come over to a lack of transparency and a lack of the normal people being able to see the data. Victorian Liberal frontbencher Andrew's government rapidly becomes the great gatekeeper of state secrets since the end of last year, 2021. Trust in the Andrews government is diminishing after Labor refused to release key documents in recent weeks, Victorian Liberal MP Richard Reardon said. The Andrews government last week appealed a decision by the Victorian Information Commissioner to release health advice used to justify the state's lockdown in February. More than 100 pages of Department of Health briefings were to be made publicly available, but departmental lawyers argued it would reveal high-level, deliberative processes of government. Mr. Reardon said Daniel Andrews has no track record of transparency after the Premier urged Victorians to trust his government. So this is the highest level of technocracy, where we aren't allowed to even see the data that's been relied upon to lock everybody down. Judge scrapped 75-year FDA timeline to release Pfizer vaccine safety data. So the FDA and Pfizer went to court twice to try and stop this freedom of information where we could actually see the safety data relied upon to give the conditional approval to the vaccines. The Food and Drug Administration won't have 75 years to release thousands of pages of documents it relied on to license its COVID-19 vaccine. Instead, the federal agency will have just over 8 months to do so per federal judge's ruling. At times, we're told the true story. Scare campaign. Underlying health issues involved in 92% of Aussie COVID deaths. This is in February 2022. Radio host Ben Fordham has claimed new data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics regarding the nation's COVID-19 death exposes the overblown scare campaign we've witnessed. The statistics released by the ABS on Tuesday showed there were underlying health issues involved in 92% of the 2,639 deaths attributed to COVID-19 between March 20 and January the 31st, 2022. The underlying conditions range from pneumonia and kidney infection to chronic health disease. During the same period, 100,000 Australians died from cancer, 32,000 from health disease, 30,000 from Alzheimer's and dementia, and 10,000 from diabetes. The COVID-19 deaths, meanwhile, made up only 1% of all fatalities nationwide. Fordham said the data had made him feel somewhat vindicated because we've done our best to call for calm during the pandemic, and we've also been warning about how this has been overhyped. The number of West Australians killed by COVID rather than with COVID. This came out on August the 8th, 2022. Western Australia recorded 18 deaths where COVID-19 was the only condition listed on the patient's death certificate in the first 6 months of its Omicron wave. In the majority of COVID-linked deaths, people have pre-existing chronic conditions, most commonly heart conditions or dementia. The Australasian College for Emergency Medicine Western Australian Chair Dr. Peter Allais said it's more common for the virus to tip the balance of a person's health, leading to death, rather than cause severe lung disease, which would require ventilation. For nearly everybody, it's just tipping the balance of their underlying medical condition, much like any other infection would do, but just with a bit more rigour. Here we have New South Wales Health with the New South Wales Premier standing behind, giving information as to how they count hospitalisations from COVID. This was back in February of this year.
Look, and we've had an expert clinical panel review how we capture COVID admissions to hospital. What we realised here in New South Wales that we had a very conservative approach to that capture, and we were back capturing people coming into hospital who, and I think I touched on this a couple of weeks ago, so incidental COVID, back capturing all the way back 28 days prior to admission. And what that meant was that in our numbers, we were getting a skewing of our data. So, for example, if you were 22 years of age, you had COVID 3 weeks ago, you'd recovered from that, fell off your bicycle, broke your arm and came to hospital, we would count you as a COVID admission. After the review by our expert clinical...
And in what is way too little too late, and possibly just another agenda unfolding itself, we have the World Health Organizations coming out and saying the long lockdowns are a failure of policy. We can see from this objective documentation that the messaging has been confusing, hidden, non-transparent. People have been encouraged to shame, police, and discriminate against others, to see each other as dangerous and in need of external controls, which is an incredibly dangerous and divisive narrative. The concerns we as welfare workers have been verified in the news articles shown, yet we were discounted. And in a time where a compassionate governing body should have been focused on minimising risks to the vulnerable, our first-hand knowledge and insight was ignored. Many welfare workers sacrificed their careers as it went against their morals to be part of a coercive campaign that was underhand and disingenuous. There are many workers from many fields that have additionally been fired, leading to an unacknowledged effect on worker shortages and the resultant issues. The utter madness of the last few years has left many of us incredulous that more people aren't furious as to the harms caused to themselves and their loved ones. Harms caused by the government and global bodies' overreach. Many of us try to make sense of it and how we can communicate to those who are in the thrall of this nonsensical narrative. We too easily understand that this will happen again, that government and global bodies will dictate the removal of people's freedom to autonomy and say over their own and their families' lives, and that the ones who question and raise considerations and concerns or even just ask for nuance will once again be shunned and disregarded. I will finish with a quote from the book, The Great COVID Panic. It's only one theory put forward, but I believe it is of merit. Another fundamental tendency of fear is to make people eager to sacrifice something in order to defeat the perceived threat. Strange as it is to a rational mind, fearful people automatically presume that if they give up something important to them, then this action will help to reduce or remove the peril. For this reason, throughout human history, people have sacrificed the things most dear to them in order to avert a perceived threat. Whatever the deeper reason, the telltale sign of the sacrificial reflex associated with human fear is disinterest among the fearful in the mechanism by which the sacrifice actually helps avert the danger. It's simply seen as axiomatic that the sacrifice helps. So while many believe that face masks are to viruses what garden gates are to mosquitoes, people possessed by fear of infection are quite prone to believing that a face mask will prevent infection because wearing one is doing something. While locking down the elderly will accelerate the process of degenerative diseases like dementia and increase the susceptibility of this already vulnerable group to other health problems, frightened people accept automatically that incarcerating them will save them from infection, while the repeated scrubbing of surfaces with chemical disinfectants is expensive, disruptive, and environmentally damaging. This too is automatically assumed by the fearful to be a sacrifice worth making. A fearful public will usually view information about how some measure will actually help to alleviate a threat as merely a bonus, not a requirement. The more painful the measure, the more likely they believe it will help simply because it is more painful. The ambivalence about the connection between a measure and its effectiveness makes it extremely difficult to question on scientific grounds a measure that has been successfully sold to the fearful as an appropriate sacrifice. It's nearly impossible to ask for scientific evidence or even suggest that there could be or should be a rational discussion about it and expect to be taken seriously. During the Great Fear and on through the illusion of control phase of the COVID era, anyone who didn't automatically go along with the new sacrifice for COVID was apt to be regarded as a dangerous heretic and quickly held down by obeying public. We saw this bullying repudiation of rational discourse time and time again in the Twitter storms against lockdown skeptics, in the millions of furious comments under news media articles, in the daily sermons of government officials and their health advisors, and in every other forum that could be co-opted by the crowd to express its disapproval of those who dared to differ. And I'm aware this is a challenging thing to raise, but I actually think it's really important while we have a very small reprieve from the social engineering and the messaging coming forward about what we can and can't say without being considered a far-right extremist or an anti-vaxxer or a public health risk or bad people. I want this video to be documenting how easy it is to make people turn against each other and to shut down divergent views and also any sense of nuance, and how dangerous that is. So I'm going to read from Behind the Green Mask, UN Agenda 21 by Rosa Kaur. There's something else that needs to be said about social engineering. Most of us, about a minute after we first heard about the Holocaust, wondered if we were the kind of people who would commit such crimes. If we were being honest with ourselves, we said no, but then we had a sort of vague, uneasy feeling. Could we be sure? In the 1970s, Professor Philip Zimbardo conducted the Stanford prison experiment at Stanford University. He was a psychologist who wanted to see if students would torture each other if given permission. He set up a prison in the university basement, randomly assigned some students to be prisoners, and others jailed and watched. The experiment had to be ended because of the brutality of the jailers. Just ordinary students. How long did it take? 6 days. Well, guess what? You're going to get your chance to see what you're made of if you haven't already. Maybe you're one of those weak ones who's already jumped on the bandwagon of spying on your neighbour for their own good. Maybe you'll be asked to reason with a neighbour. You'll be told that you're such an important insider. Hey, the mayor will thank you. Flattery is a big manipulator. Maybe it will take just a little more to push you over the edge when your child comes home and says, Billy's mum says you're crazy if you don't support something, and she's mad that you're not going to go along with the neighbourhood. Would you go along? Maybe you'll just hide anonymously, since it would maybe cost you your job to stand up. I will leave you to consider what Rosa's raised there. Good people can do really awful things given the right pressure and given the justification. Earlier in the video, I posed the question, who has really benefited from the last few years? So the common good argument, do it for the common good. Who's the common good? When I look around and I talk to people, I see that people have really struggled over the last few years, some terribly so, especially if they stood up or protested or tried to have their voice heard. Others have struggled as well. In a repeat of what we've seen in our own neighbourhoods where smaller businesses closed, yet Coles, Woolworths and Bunnings stayed open, it should be no surprise that it was the wealthiest who had the biggest bonuses from the last few years. Fortune 500, the 68th edition of their annual ranking of America's largest companies. It was a blowout year for the companies featured. Despite rising inflation, the ongoing supply chain crisis, and the second year of the COVID-19 pandemic, together the 500 corporations on this year's list generated a record $16.1 trillion in revenue and $1.8 trillion in profits. And this was published in 17th of January 2022 by Oxfam. The world's 10 richest men more than doubled their fortunes from $700 billion to $1.5 trillion. At a rate of $15,000 per second, or 1.3 billion per day, during the first 2 years of a pandemic that has seen the incomes of 99% of humanity fall and over 160 million more people forced into poverty. I will finish my lament and my attempted documentation with these 4 questions. How much are we willing to sacrifice for the authorities to purportedly keep us safe? Are we willing to sacrifice our most vulnerable? What happens to our humanity when we do this? And does it really keep us safe? You can find the welfare letters and testimonials on Community Services Speak Out, which is both on Facebook and Telegram. You can also get in touch to request these on Ostwelfare, AUSTWELFARE, at tutanato.com, TUTANOTA.com. So be kind and stay human.